There was a place where people believed in signs, in witches, in sorceresses, and in everything they could not quite explain. It was a small village, nestled between hills and fear, where any difference became gossip, and any gossip could become a death sentence. And when the villagers decided someone carried something too dangerous, the punishment came swiftly, without defense, without mercy. Lara had known this her whole life. Orphaned, poor, rejected from childhood, she learned to hide what was rarest within her, because she knew that discovery would turn her already difficult existence into something far worse. She heard what no one else could hear. And when an animal lay dying, Lara's hands would fill with a silent, golden light. Eyes would open again. The impossible would happen, and Lara would keep the miracle to herself, because she knew the village did not celebrate miracles. It condemned them. So when a wolf appeared, sick, weak, stumbling between the cottages, no one dared approach. The men wanted to drive it away. The women exchanged worried glances. Only Lara stepped forward, and when she walked away, the wolf was healed. What she did not know was that someone was watching. Then came the sentence. "Witch! Forest witch!" Someone shouted from the back of the crowd. Bound in the public square, the village gathered to witness her end. And what no one knew, as they prepared her punishment, was that the wolf she had saved was no ordinary beast. It was the Alpha King's wolf. And when destiny finally rode down the road to that forgotten village, nothing there would ever remain the same. You love intense wolf stories with destiny and twists? Go ahead and subscribe to the channel right now. So subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any chapters. And how about we get to know each other better? I'm Maggie Reed, the author of these stories, and you? Drop a comment below with your name and what city you're watching from. The smell of burning wood arrived before anything else. Lara caught the scent piercing through her nostrils while the guards dragged her down the cobblestone path that cut through the center of the village. Her bare feet scraped against the gravel, and she refused to let out even a single whimper. She was not going to give them that satisfaction. She never had. Not as a child, when the other kids threw rocks at her and called her the girl with no name. Not when old Marta threw her out of the only cabin that had ever served as shelter on a stormy night. And she certainly was not going to start now, tied up like a bundle of waste to be disposed of in the middle of the square. The crowd was already gathered. She scanned the familiar faces, the baker, the washerwoman, the blacksmith in his grimy apron, all of them standing there, eyes lit with a kind of excitement she had long since learned to recognize. It was not pure cruelty. It was something worse. The relief of people who had finally found someone to blame for everything that had gone wrong. Last month's drought, the calf born dead, the child with the fever. All of it apparently was her fault now. Witch! Forest witch! Someone hollered from the back of the crowd, and the word spread across the square like an ember carried by the wind. Lara lifted her chin. The ropes bit into her wrists, rough and far too tight, and she could already feel the tingling of fingers losing circulation. The central post in the square was tall, thick, dark wood driven deep into the earth, as if it had always known what it would one day be used for. The guards shoved her against it with more force than necessary. Her shoulder struck the wood hard, the impact shooting up through her arm. But she did not turn away. She fixed her gaze on the farthest point she could make out. The top of the hill where the forest began, dense and silent, indifferent to all of this human madness. It had all started 3 days ago, because of a wolf. A wolf she never should have touched. He had appeared at the edge of the market on a cold morning, so still and so exhausted that Lara first thought he was a large, abandoned dog. But when she moved closer, she saw the thick coat, the wide paws, the amber eyes half closed with fever, and she understood. It was a wolf that was dying slowly, with an infected wound on his left front paw and the look of an animal that had already made peace with the end. The entire village wanted him gone. Men with torches and pitchforks surrounded him from a safe distance, shouting that he was dangerous, that he would attack the children, that he needed to be killed or driven away. Nobody got close enough to do either. They just made noise, as they always did. Lara had been passing through with her few herbs, on her way to the stream to wash the only change of clothes she owned. She stopped. She looked at the wolf. The wolf looked at her. And then he spoke, in a hoarse and small voice that only she could hear. "Are you really going to let me die here, surrounded by these screaming idiots?" She nearly dropped her basket. "You just talked," she whispered, low enough that no one around her noticed. "Obviously I talked, and you're wasting time. The infection has already reached my knee." Lara glanced around. The men with torches were still arguing among themselves, trying to decide who would be the first to step forward, which, in practice, meant none of them ever would. She dropped the herb basket onto the ground, knelt down in the mud, and stretched her hand toward the wolf. "Don't bite," she warned quietly. "I only bite people who deserve it," the wolf replied, and then he lowered his enormous head onto her knee, with the sigh of a creature far too exhausted to keep up his pride any longer. Lara's gift was not something she fully understood. She had never learned it from anyone, never read about it in any book, because she had never owned a book. All she knew was that when she placed her open hands on a sick animal and let the warmth rise from somewhere deep inside her chest, something happened. Infections closed. Fevers broke. Eyes regained their light. It was as if her body knew a path that her mind could not map. With the wolf, it took nearly 2 hours. She did not notice the time passing. She did not notice the cold mud soaking through her knees, nor the crowd that had scattered and returned, smaller now, watching with a different kind of curiosity, quieter, sharper. She only came back to herself when the wolf lifted his head and shook his ears, as if testing whether everything still worked. "Thank you," he said, with the dignity of a creature unaccustomed to gratitude. "You smell like forest. Is that where you're from?" "No. I'm from the village. I just sleep near the forest because it's safer than in here." The wolf made a sound, the lupine equivalent of a scoff, which Lara interpreted as contempt. Strange people. Then he stood, shook out his fur, and disappeared into the trees without looking back. Lara was left alone, mud on her knees, and her hands still warm from the spent gift. And then she heard the voice of Widow Petra, the oldest, the most respected, and for some reason the cruelest woman in the village. I saw it. We all saw it. She put her hands on that animal and it healed. That is not kindness. That is witchcraft. 3 days later, Lara was tied to a post with dry wood piled at her feet. The village judge, a heavy-set man who sweated even in the cold, read the sentence from a crumpled parchment, his voice swollen with the self-importance of someone performing a role he believed in. Lara did not hear the words. She heard only the wind moving across the rooftops, the rustling of leaves up on the hill, and, from somewhere nearby, the irritated chirping of a sparrow perched on the highest window of the council building. "Aren't you going to defend yourself?" the sparrow said, tilting his tiny head to one side. "With what?" she answered in her mind, without moving her lips. "I don't know. Words. Humans love words. Words mean nothing when people have already decided what they want to see." The sparrow huffed. "Drama. Pure human drama. I've been watching you people since the beginning and I still don't understand how your species survived this long." Lara might have smiled, if not for the guard approaching with a lit torch. The orange flame trembled in the wind. The crowd took a small step back, as if the heat were already reaching them. Or as if, deep down, none of them truly wanted to be close to the moment when this became real. It was far easier to shout than to witness. Lara knew that pattern. She had known it her whole life. She closed her eyes, not from fear. But because there was one thing she had always done when the weight of the world grew too heavy, she searched, in the darkness behind her eyelids, for the face of her mother, a face she barely remembered, just a warm outline and a scent of lemon balm. And she stayed there for a moment, just one moment, before facing whatever came next. The wind shifted direction, and then the sound came. Not the sound of the fire. Something else, deep, rhythmic, building. The sound of hooves striking the earth at full gallop, coming from the main road, so powerful and so fast that the very ground seemed to vibrate beneath the feet of the crowd. Lara opened her eyes. The guard with the torch had stopped, confused, staring toward the entrance of the square. And there, framed against the white midday light, a figure on horseback burst through the main road at a speed that sent the crowd scattering in waves. The horse was enormous and black, and the man on its back wore no cape, no insignia. But there was something about him, in the way he held the reins, in the way his eyes swept the entire square from end to end and stopped suddenly on her. That made it clear, without a single word needing to be spoken. That man had not come to watch. His name was Kaden Blackthornne, and the last time anyone in his kingdom had seen him laugh, truly laugh, not the polite, controlled curve of the lips he offered at formal audiences, was 3 years ago, before the weight of the crown had finished swallowing him whole. He had ridden for 6 hours straight when the village came into view. It was Rook who had brought him here. Rook, his wolf, his companion since childhood, the silver-coated, insufferably opinionated animal who had disappeared 4 days ago during a solo hunt and caused the kind of quiet panic in the royal court that nobody dared name out loud. Kaden had turned the search into a military exercise, dispatching scouts in every direction, issuing orders with the clipped precision of a man who did not know what to do with fear and had therefore decided to turn it into logistics. And then, that very morning, Rook had appeared at the castle gate, limping slightly, carrying a piece of torn fabric in his mouth. He had dropped it at Kaden's feet with the solemnity of a wolf delivering a verdict, then sat down and stared at him with those amber eyes that always seemed to be judging him for something. "She fixed me," Rook had said simply. "Who?" "The girl who smells like forest and rain, and they're going to burn her for it." Kaden had been on his horse before Rook finished the sentence. Now he stood in the middle of the square, and the crowd that had been so loud 30 seconds ago had gone so quiet that he could hear the torch sputtering in the guard's hand. He did not announce himself. He did not need to. The crest on his horse's saddle was enough. The black wolf over a silver field, the sigil of the Blackthorne line, known across every territory from the northern ridges to the coast. 2 of the council members in the front row went pale so fast it looked like a coordinated performance. His eyes found her immediately. She was tied to the post with her chin up, her dark hair loose and tangled, her feet bare and scraped red from the cobblestones. She looked like she had been dragged through half the village, which he would later learn was exactly what had happened. But what stopped him, what made something shift unexpectedly in his chest, was not the state she was in. It was the expression on her face. She was not begging, she was not weeping. She was looking at him with the specific, measuring, slightly suspicious look of someone trying to determine whether this new development was actually better or just differently terrible. He dismounted in one clean movement and walked toward the post. The guard with the torch took 3 steps back without being asked. Kaden pulled a short blade from his belt and cut the ropes from her wrists without ceremony, without a word, the way you remove something that should never have been there in the first place. The hemp fell to the ground. Lara's hands dropped forward and she grabbed the post for a half second to steady herself, because her legs, which had been locked in place for over an hour, had opinions about moving suddenly. "Smooth entrance?" a voice said somewhere near her left ear. She cut her eyes sideways. The sparrow, Pip, she had named him 3 weeks ago when he first started following her around the market, was perched on the post approximately 4 inches from her face. "Not now, Pip." I'm just saying, very dramatic, very cinematic. The horse was a nice touch. I will never feed you again. You never feed me anyway, you have no food. Kaden, who heard none of this, turned to face the crowd. When he spoke, his voice was not raised. It did not need to be. This woman is under the protection of the Blackthorne crown. He let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. Anyone who disagrees is welcome to present their case to my judiciary. In writing, within 30 days. Another pause. I'll wait. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. And then, from the back of the crowd, a single voice cut through the silence with the particular bitterness of someone who had been rehearsing this moment in his head for years. She's a witch, my lord. We have a witness. The crowd parted slightly, and Dorian Hale stepped forward. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of aggressively handsome face that worked hard to hide what was underneath. He was also the son of the village's wealthiest merchant, which in this particular settlement meant he was accustomed to getting what he wanted through money when charm failed and through pressure when money wasn't fast enough. He had wanted Lara for the better part of 4 years, not in any way that resembled love, but in the way a man wants something specifically because it keeps refusing to belong to him. She had said no. She had said no calmly, then firmly, then finally with the kind of tired finality that left no room for interpretation. He had never forgiven her for it. Lara felt his eyes on her now, not the crowd's collective stare, but his, specific and sharp and dressed up as righteous concern. I knew it, she thought. I knew his name would be somewhere in this. The witness, Kaden said, and something in his tone suggested he had already formed an opinion of Dorian Hale in approximately 4 seconds. Saw a woman heal an animal. She used dark. She used her hands. Kaden tilted his head slightly, the way a man does when he is being patient on purpose. My wolf is alive because of those hands. Would you like to explain to me slowly why that is a crime? Dorian's jaw tightened. He was not used to being interrupted. The old laws of this village do not supersede the crown. Kaden turned away from him, which was, as every person in that square understood, the most complete dismissal possible. He turned back to Lara. Can you walk? She straightened her spine. I've been walking my whole life. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. More like the memory of one, surprised into existence before he could stop it. It was gone almost immediately, replaced by the composed neutrality of a king in public. But she saw it. And Pip, who saw everything, made a soft sound that in sparrow language translated roughly as, "Oh, this is going to be interesting." Rook was waiting at the edge of the square. When Lara saw him, healed, standing straight, his silver coat catching the afternoon light, she stopped walking. Something loosened in her chest that she hadn't realized was tight. He was alive. He was whole. Whatever trouble his existence had cost her, she would not have undone it. Rook looked at her with those amber eyes, then looked at Kaden, then looked back at her. He hasn't smiled like that in 3 years, Rook said quietly, so only she could hear. I want you to know that I take full credit. You take credit for being sick and lost in a village. I take credit for the outcome. He sat down with enormous dignity. You're welcome. Kaden had come to stand beside her without her noticing, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off him after hours of hard riding. He was looking at Rook with the careful, controlled affection of a man who showed love through proximity rather than words. He likes you, Kaden said. He doesn't like anyone. Animals usually do like me. She paused. People less so. He glanced at her sideways. I've noticed people here have poor judgment. It was such a simple thing to say, such a straightforward, almost casual defense of her. And yet something about it hit Lara in a place that had been hollow for so long, she had stopped noticing the emptiness. The place where being seen was supposed to live. She did not let it show. She was very good at not letting things show. From 20 feet away, Dorian Hale watched the two of them standing together near the Silver Wolf, and his expression did something complicated and ugly that he smoothed over quickly with a smile that reached nowhere near his eyes. He was not done. He was, in fact, just getting started. The road out of the village was quieter than Lara expected. She had imagined, in the 30 seconds between Kaden cutting her ropes and the crowd dissolving into murmurs, that leaving would feel like escape. Like running. Like finally exhaling after years of holding her breath in a place that had never once made room for her. Instead, it felt strangely ordinary. One foot in front of the other, gravel becoming dirt. The village sounds fading behind her like a song you were never fond of anyway. Kaden rode slowly to her left, and he had not said much since the square. He was the kind of man, she was quickly learning, who communicated in silences the way other people communicated in sentences. Each pause carrying weight, each glance measured and deliberate. It should have been intimidating. It was, a little. "He keeps looking at you," Pip announced from her right shoulder, where he had installed himself with the confidence of a bird who owned everything he perched on. "I know. Like, a lot. Like a lot? A lot. Pip, I need you to be quiet for 5 minutes. I can do 3. Rook, walking alongside Kaden's horse with the careful gait of a wolf who was healed but not about to admit he was still a little sore, glanced back at Lara with an expression she was beginning to identify as his thinking face. "He wants to ask you something," Rook said. "Then he can ask. He's a king. They don't ask. They announce, and then they look at you until you agree. That sounds exhausting. You have no idea." As if on cue, Kaden pulled his horse to a slow stop at the edge of a wide oak tree's shadow and looked down at her. Up close, closer than she'd been able to properly register in the chaos of the square. He was younger than the authority in his bearing suggested. There were shadows under his eyes that had nothing to do with the day's ride. A tension in the line of his jaw that looked permanent, like something he'd been clenching for so long he'd forgotten how to release it. "You have nowhere to go," he said. Not a question. Lara met his gaze without flinching. "I have plenty of places to go." "Name one." She opened her mouth, closed it. The honest answer was the Riacho, the stream where she sometimes slept under the overhang when it rained, curled against a flat stone she'd dragged into position 2 winters ago. That was not, she was aware, a compelling rebuttal. "I'm working on it," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. The same ghost of a smile she'd seen in the square, there and gone before it could be confirmed. "Come to the castle," he said. "You'll have a room, meals, safety. And what do I give in exchange?" He paused, and she realized he genuinely hadn't considered the question, which was either admirable or alarming. "Nothing," he said finally. "You healed Rook. That's not something I can repay with a room and a meal, but it's a start." Rook made a sound that in wolf language was the equivalent of finally, he said something right. Lara studied Kaden for a long moment. She was used to reading people, not as a skill she'd cultivated, but as a survival mechanism she'd developed early, the way all orphans did. She looked for the lie behind the offer, the angle, the cost hidden in the fine print of a kind gesture. She found something she didn't expect: exhaustion. Deep, genuine, bone-level exhaustion. The kind that had nothing to do with today's ride and everything to do with years of carrying something heavy alone. She recognized it. She'd been wearing the same thing her whole life. "Okay," she said. "Just that." He nodded, turned his horse back onto the road, and absolutely did not let her see that the tightness in his shoulders had eased by a fraction. Rook saw it. Rook saw everything. Back in the village, Dorian Hale stood in his father's empty study and stared at the cold fireplace. This was where he did his clearest thinking, in the silence of a room that smelled like old money and older expectations. His father, Marcus Hale, had built their family's fortune on trades that benefited from other people's misfortune, and Dorian had spent 26 years watching how it was done. He was not, in his own mind, a villain. Villains in stories were cartoons, sneering, deliberate, proud of the damage they caused. Dorian was none of those things. He was a man who had loved someone completely and been refused so many times that the love had curdled into something he no longer had a clean name for. He told himself the story differently. She was too proud, too stubborn, too convinced the world owed her nothing when in fact he could have given her everything. He had offered her a home. He had offered her his name. She had looked at him both times with a kind of quiet, absolute clarity that he found infuriating precisely because it wasn't cruel. She hadn't been mean about it. She had simply been certain. He hated her certainty. He had orchestrated the accusation carefully, fed Widow Petra just enough suggestion, just enough manufactured outrage, stood back and let the village do the rest. He had not intended for it to go this far. A scare, perhaps. A few days of fear, days of something to make her understand how quickly safety could be withdrawn, and how much she needed someone with walls and a name and resources. He had not expected a king. He pulled the cork from a decanter on the desk and poured 2 fingers of amber liquid, then stood there holding the glass without drinking. The worst part, the part he kept circling back to, unable to look at directly, was the way Kaden Blackthornne had looked at her. Not the way men looked at beautiful women. Not the way powerful men looked at things they intended to acquire. Something quieter. Something that had no strategy in it at all. Dorian took a long drink. He was not done. That was still true. But for the first time since this morning, he felt the cold weight of the possibility that he had moved a piece on a board without fully understanding which game was being played. The castle appeared at dusk. Lara had never seen it up close. Nobody from the village had business this far east, and she was prepared to be unimpressed, out of principle. She was not unimpressed. It rose from the ridge like something that had grown there rather than been built. Dark stone threaded with climbing vines that had been allowed to stay, towers that caught the last orange light and held it. It was not perfect. A section of the east wall was clearly mid-repair, scaffolding visible against the stone. One of the gate torches had gone out. A cat sat directly in the center of the main entrance, blocking the path with the sovereign authority only cats possess. Kaden's horse stopped. The cat did not move. "That's Duchess," Rook said in a tone that communicated years of history. "She's not going to move, is she?" Lara said. "She never moves. She decided that spot was hers in the winter of his 2nd year as king, and nobody has successfully argued otherwise." Pip made a soft sound of pure professional admiration. Lara looked up at Kaden, who was sitting on a 17-hand horse, staring down at a 6-pound cat with the expression of a man who had lost this particular standoff many times before. "Does she do this to everyone?" Lara asked. "Just me," he said. "She likes everyone else." "Sounds like she has excellent judgment." He turned and looked at her, and this time, the smile broke through completely. Brief, real, slightly startled, like something that had forgotten how to happen and suddenly remembered. It transformed his face in a way that made Lara's next breath come out slightly uneven, which she blamed entirely on the long day and the residual stress of nearly being burned alive. Duchess stood, stretched with exquisite slowness, and walked aside. Kaden rode through the gate. Lara followed, and behind her Pip landed on her shoulder and said very quietly, 3 years, Rook said. The man hasn't smiled in 3 years. She didn't answer, but she didn't tell him to be quiet either. The room they gave her was bigger than any space she had ever slept in. That was not, technically, a high bar to clear. She had spent the better part of 2 winters under a stream overhang, and the 3 years before that, in a storage shed behind the market, that the owner had pretended not to notice she was using. But still, the room had a window with actual glass in it, a bed with a frame and a real mattress, and a small fireplace that someone had already lit, the fire crackling with the cheerful indifference of something that had never known a cold night in its life. Lara stood in the doorway for a long moment before walking in. Pip flew past her immediately and claimed the curtain rod. "Dibs," he announced. "You can't dibs a curtain rod." "I just did. Also, there's a spider up here and I'm going to eat it. Don't be dramatic." A young woman appeared behind Lara in the hallway. Early 20s, dark braids, a ring of keys at her hip that jingled with every step like a very small, very committed marching band. She introduced herself as Nessa, the castle's head housekeeper, with the brisk efficiency of someone who had approximately 400 things to do and was choosing to give Lara 45 seconds of her full attention. "Dinner is in an hour," Nessa said, eyeing Pip on the curtain rod with the particular expression of someone adding bird situation to a mental list. "The king dines alone, usually. Tonight he asked for a second place to be set." Lara turned from the window. "He asked, or he announced?" Nessa's mouth twitched. "In this castle, those are the same thing. But," she paused, and something honest moved across her face. "He said please, which he hasn't said at a dinner request in about 2 years." She looked at Lara with open, unabashed curiosity. "Whatever you did today, I'd like it to continue." She left before Lara could respond, keys jingling down the hallway like punctuation. "I like her," Pip said. "You like anyone who doesn't try to shoo you away." "Exactly. High standards." Dinner was in a room that was clearly meant for 30 people and had been set tonight for 2. Kaden was already there when she arrived, standing at the window with a glass of wine he hadn't touched, looking out at the darkening ridge with the expression of a man reviewing something private in his head. He heard her come in. She knew he heard because his shoulders changed, the set of them shifting from solitary to present. But he gave her a moment before turning, which she found unexpectedly considerate. "You changed," he said. She had. Nessa had appeared 20 minutes earlier with a dress that was simple and clean and fit well enough that Lara suspected it had not been entirely accidental. She had also washed the cobblestone grime from her face and done something approximate to combing her hair. "Seemed like the minimum requirement," she said. "The minimum requirement for what?" "For sitting across from someone who showed up this morning on a horse that probably costs more than this entire village's annual income." He looked at her for a moment, then pulled out the chair across from his with a small, deliberate gesture. "For the record," he said, sitting, "the horse's name is Ajax, and he's going to be insufferable about that comparison for weeks." "Already am," said a large presence from the direction of the stables, through the open window, in a deep voice that carried the self-satisfaction of a horse who had just been given an opening. Lara sat down slowly. "Your horse talks too?" "All animals talk," Kaden said, as if this were a mild weather observation. "Most people just don't listen." She stared at him. "You can hear them?" "Since I was 7. Rook was my first." He picked up his wine glass. "I assumed everyone could until I was 11 and mentioned it to my father's advisor. That was an educational afternoon." Something cracked open between them in that moment, not dramatically, not with fanfare, but with the quiet, irreversible sound of a door that had been locked for a long time swinging gently on its hinge. She had spent her entire life believing she was the only one. Every strange look, every whispered accusation, every year of careful silence, all of it resting on that one lonely assumption. She was not the only one. She set her fork down. "How many people know?" 3. Rook, Nessa, and now you." "Nessa knows?" "She caught me having an argument with Duchess about who left a window open in the East Wing. I lost the argument, for the record. The cat's case was surprisingly well structured." Lara laughed. It came out before she could calibrate it. Real and sudden. The kind of laugh you can't perform and can't stop. and it filled the enormous empty dining room in a way that made the room feel, for just a second, like it had been designed for exactly this. Kaden watched it happen with an expression she couldn't fully name. Something between surprise and the specific, careful look of a man witnessing something rare and trying very hard not to move in case it stopped. The silence afterward was warm. "You should do that more," he said. "Laugh at your expense? In this room." He looked at the table, at the 2 plates in the sea of empty space. "It's been quiet in here for a while." 40 miles south, in a roadside inn that smelled of damp wood and overcooked stew, Dorian Hale spread a hand-drawn map across a sticky table and looked at the man sitting across from him. His name was Croft, former court messenger, currently available for work that didn't require a formal contract or a clear conscience. He had small eyes and large ears and the kind of forgettable face that was professionally useful. "I need information," Dorian said. "About the Blackthorne King, specifically, anything the Crown wouldn't want circulated. Old debts, old decisions, old mistakes," Croft offered. "History," Dorian said, because he was telling himself a cleaner version of the story. "I need to understand who I'm dealing with." Croft tilted his head. "And the girl?" Dorian's jaw tightened. He smoothed it deliberately. "She's irrelevant." He said it the way people say things they need to believe. Croft, who was professionally observant, noted this and said nothing. Back at the castle, Dorian's name had not come up once over dinner. That, in its own quiet way, was already a kind of loss. Lara found Rook in the castle courtyard after dinner, lying on a flat stone in the way wolves lay when they wanted to think, and also wanted company, but weren't going to admit to the second part. She sat beside him without being invited, which he accepted by shifting 2 inches to give her more room. "He talked at dinner," Rook said, not a question. "We both did." "He doesn't, usually. Not really. He answers. He responds. He manages conversation. He doesn't actually talk." Rook was quiet for a moment. "His mother died when he was 9. His father 2 years into his reign. He's been doing this alone for a long time." Lara looked up at the castle walls, at the lit windows, at the dark tower at the far end where she'd noticed, during dinner, that Kaden's eyes had gone twice without explanation. "What's in the East Tower?" she asked. "His father's study. He hasn't opened it in 3 years." Rook's amber eyes caught the moonlight. Same amount of time since he smiled. She sat with that for a while. Above her, Pip was asleep on the curtain rod inside her room, making small sounds that were either dreams or complaints. With Pip, the distinction was academic. The castle was quiet and enormous around her, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, the quiet did not feel like loneliness. It felt like something she didn't quite have a name for yet. Something that, if she were less careful and less scarred, she might have called the beginning. She was not supposed to go up there. Nobody had told her that explicitly. There were no signs, no locks, no stern-faced guard posted at the base of the East Tower stairs with instructions to turn away curious Omega women who had already survived one near-death experience this week. But the castle had a way of communicating things without words, the same way old buildings always do. A colder draft in that corridor. Torches that had not been replaced in so long they were down to stubs. Stone steps that had not been swept in months. A thin film of dust undisturbed by foot traffic. Everything about that hallway said, "Nobody goes here anymore." Which was, if Lara was being honest with herself, precisely why she was standing at the bottom of those stairs at 7 in the morning with a candle in her hand. "Bad idea," Pip said from her shoulder. "Probably." Historically, when someone says nobody goes there anymore, that's a hint. Or it's a room that needs to be opened. Pip was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. "Okay, but if there's something weird up there, I want it noted that I said bad idea first." The door at the top was unlocked. She pushed it open slowly and held the candle up. It was a study. Books along every wall, a wide oak desk, papers still spread across the surface as if someone had stepped out momentarily 3 years ago and simply never returned. A leather chair behind the desk, worn at the armrests, a cold fireplace, and on the corner of the desk, a small framed drawing, charcoal on paper, of a boy of maybe 9 years old sitting with a large silver wolf pup, both of them looking at something outside the frame with the same alert, slightly suspicious expression. Lara picked it up carefully. The boy was unmistakably Kaden. "You found it." She turned. He was standing in the doorway, and she expected anger. She had walked uninvited into the most private room in his castle, but what was on his face was something rawer than anger. The specific, undefended look of someone who had been caught feeling something they had not planned to feel today. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. "I shouldn't have. It's fine." He stepped inside, and the room seemed to exhale around him like it had been waiting. He looked at the drawing in her hands. "That was the day my father gave me Rook. I was 8, not 9. I always looked older than I was." He paused. "My father drew it." She set it back down gently. "He was an artist. On weekends. During the week he was a king, which apparently didn't leave a lot of room for anything else." Something in his voice was careful, the way people are careful around wounds that have not finished healing. "I've been trying to figure out how to be both things. I haven't solved it yet." "You came for me yesterday," she said. "That wasn't a king thing. That was a person thing." He looked at her across the desk, in the cold morning light filtering through the dusty window, and she watched him process that. Watched him receive it the way someone receives something they needed but had stopped expecting. His throat moved. "Rook told me someone was going to die because they helped him," he said finally. "I didn't think about it. I just went." "For the record," Rook's voice drifted up from the courtyard below, through the cracked window. "I told him in great detail, and he was saddled and out the gate before I finished the sentence." "I was going to leave that part out," Kaden said, without raising his voice. "Too late." Lara set her candle down on the corner of the desk and looked at the room around her. At the books and the papers and the cold fireplace and the ghost of a man she'd never met, who had drawn his son with a wolf pup and left behind a room full of the weight of everything unfinished. "You could light the fireplace," she said. "Not every day. Just sometimes. It doesn't have to mean you're over it. It just means you're still in it." The silence that followed was the longest one yet. "That's oddly specific advice," he said. "I've had a lot of practice keeping things alive in cold rooms." Nessa found them there an hour later, which she reported to Duchess in the kitchen corridor with the restrained excitement of someone who had been hoping for this particular development for approximately 2 years. Duchess, who was eating, did not look up. "Obviously," she said. "You knew?" "I know everything. I live here." She licked her paw. "Also, the wolf told me." "Rook gossips? Everyone gossips. Some of us are just more honest about it." The problem arrived at midday in the form of a formal letter. Kaden read it at his desk. The real desk, the working one in the main study, not his father's, with the stillness of a man absorbing information he had hoped not to receive. Lara was in the courtyard below with Rook, throwing sticks she'd found near the garden wall. Rook was not fetching them. He was a wolf, not a retriever, and he had made that distinction loudly and repeatedly, but he was tracking them with his eyes and occasionally moving to stand near where they landed, which he maintained was entirely different. Nessa knocked and entered. "Trouble?" Kaden set the letter down. "Dorian Hale has filed a formal grievance with the regional council. He's claiming the crown intervened unlawfully in a village proceeding and is requesting a hearing." Nessa crossed her arms. "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that I had a personal interest in the accused." A pause. "Which is technically not untrue. He's trying to get her sent back." He's trying to create a process long enough and public enough that it damages both of us regardless of outcome. Kaden leaned back. He's smarter than I gave him credit for this morning. Nessa was quiet for a moment. Does she know? He looked out the window, down at the courtyard where Lara had given up on Rook, and was now apparently having a conversation with a garden sparrow that had nothing to do with stick retrieval. Not yet. She'll want to know. I know. She's not the kind of person you protect by keeping things from her. Kaden looked at his advisor for a long moment. When did you become so certain about what kind of person she is? She's been here less than 24 hours. Nessa's expression was perfectly composed. She laughed at dinner last night, genuinely, in this dining room. She turned for the door. That tells me everything I need to know about her character. He found Lara at the garden wall as Pip was explaining, in extensive detail, that the Castle Sparrow population had a complex territorial system that she really ought to understand before interfering with the stick situation. There's a hierarchy, Pip was saying. I'm not saying I'm at the top of it, but I'm also not saying I'm not. Pip, you've been here one night. I work fast. Kaden stopped a few feet away. Can I talk to you? She read his face before he said another word. She had been reading faces her whole life, the way people read weather, looking for the thing that was actually coming. It's Dorian, she said. He didn't ask how she knew. He's filed a grievance. There will be a formal hearing. She absorbed it steadily, in the way she absorbed most things, without panic, with the careful, practiced stillness of someone who had learned early that falling apart was a luxury. But he was close enough to see the smallest tightening at the corners of her eyes, the cost of that stillness. He won't stop, she said. He never stops. She paused, and for one brief, unguarded second, the exhaustion underneath showed through. Not weakness, just the truth of how long she'd been carrying it. I've been saying no to him for 4 years. Every time I think it's over, he finds another door. Kaden was quiet. Then, he has one door left. After this hearing, he won't have standing to come near you again. His voice was even, certain, the tone of a man who had spent years solving problems before they could spread. I'll make sure of it. She looked at him carefully. You sound very confident for someone who just called him smarter than expected. I said smarter than I gave him credit for this morning. The corner of his mouth moved. That's still a low bar. The exhale she let out was not quite a laugh, but it was close enough that Pip, from the garden wall, made a small satisfied sound and said, Progress. The regional council met in a building that smelled like old wood, older opinions, and the particular mustiness of men who had been making decisions about other people's lives for so long they had forgotten to question whether they should. There were 5 of them behind the raised table, gray-haired, formally dressed, wearing the careful neutral expressions of people who were already leaning one direction and needed the proceeding to look like they weren't. Lara recognized the type. She had stood before smaller versions of this her whole life. The village elder who decided where she could and couldn't sleep, the market master who let her gather leftover scraps only on certain days, the widow Petra and her committee of certainties, men and women who held small amounts of power and protected it with the ferocity of people who knew it was all they had. Dorian was already seated on the petitioner's side when they arrived. He looked composed, dressed well, not ostentatiously, but precisely, the way a man dresses when he wants to project reason rather than ambition. He had even managed, somehow, to arrange his expression into something that resembled genuine concern, and Lara, who knew his face better than she ever wanted to, felt the familiar, cold recognition of watching someone perform a version of themselves that had nothing to do with who they actually were. He caught her eye across the room, and for just a fraction of a second, before the performance reassembled itself, she saw it. Not malice. Something worse and more complicated, real pain, bent badly out of shape by years of not knowing what to do with it. She looked away first, not because she was intimidated, because there was nothing useful to do with that information right now. Kaden sat beside her at the respondent's table, and if he was concerned, his body had not received the memo. He had the preternatural stillness of someone who had attended 100 proceedings and understood that composure was its own form of argument. Rook, who was not technically permitted inside the council building, was visible through the single high window, specifically his eyes, which had found the gap in the shutters with the precision of a wolf who had been waiting outside many proceedings and had developed a system. "How does it look?" he asked Lara quietly. "2 of the 5 are already decided against us," she answered without moving her lips. "The one on the far left keeps looking at Kaden like he owes him something. The middle one is actually listening. So we need 3. We need the middle one and one of the undecideds. What does Pip think?" She glanced sideways. Pip had installed himself in the rafters, which was, she was increasingly convinced, his default position in any new space. Pip thinks the man on the far right has seed in his left coat pocket and is therefore a person of excellent character. That's not useful analysis. It's what I've got. Dorian presented his case with the smooth, unhurried confidence of someone who had rehearsed it until it sounded spontaneous. The Crown's intervention, he argued, had been personal rather than judicial. The village proceeding had followed established local custom. The woman in question had no official standing, no family, no documented history within any registered territory. She was, in the technical language of regional law, an unaffiliated individual, not subject to Crown protection until formal claim was made. The king had acted on personal interest before any such claim existed. It was, Lara had to admit, a well-built argument. The middle counselor leaned forward. "Lord Hale, you were present at the proceeding in question?" "I was." "And you filed the original accusation?" A pause, brief, handled smoothly. "I provided a witness account. The proceeding was initiated by the village council, not by me personally." "Liar," Pip said from the rafters, loudly enough that a pigeon 3 beams over shifted uncomfortably. The middle counselor looked up at the ceiling for a moment, then back down. "And your interest in this matter is—" "The integrity of established process, counselor." Kaden spoke for the first time, quietly, without standing. "May I?" The chair nodded. "I arrived at the village because my wolf, a creature registered to the Blackthornne Crown since birth, documented in the Royal Ledger under entry 472, was nearly burned alive alongside the woman who healed him." He paused. "Under Crown law, anyone who renders aid to a registered royal companion is entitled to immediate Crown protection. That protection predates any village proceeding. It existed the moment she touched him." He placed a folded document on the table. Entry 472, and the relevant statute. Page 3, paragraph 2. The far left counselor's expression shifted. The undecided one on the right reached for the document. Dorian's composure did not crack, but it tightened, the way a well-built structure tightens in wind. He had not known about the statute. Croft had not found it. And in the stillness of that moment, watching the middle counselor read page 3, paragraph 2, Lara understood that Kaden had not simply come to that hearing prepared. He had come having already won, and had let Dorian speak first as a professional courtesy. She leaned 2 inches toward him and said, very quietly, "You knew the whole time." "Since yesterday morning," he murmured back. "And you let me worry about it all night?" "I told you he only had 1 door left. You could have mentioned the statute." "I thought the metaphor was clear." "It really wasn't," Rook said through the window. "Extremely not clear," Pip added from the rafters. The council deliberated for 11 minutes. The outcome was 3-2 in Kaden's favor, which was 1 more vote than he'd needed and 1 fewer than Dorian had hoped for. Formal Crown protection was confirmed. The village proceeding was ruled procedurally superseded. Dorian's grievance was dismissed. Outside, the afternoon was bright and unreasonably cheerful given the morning's events. Dorian found her near the steps, not by accident. Lara. He said her name the same way he always had, like it was something he owned. She turned and waited, because she had stopped running from conversations she could not permanently avoid. He looked tired. Not strategically tired. Actually tired, the kind that lived behind the eyes. I know you think I orchestrated this. I know you orchestrated this. He looked down at the street. Something in his jaw worked silently for a moment. I thought... He stopped. Started again. I thought if you had nothing, you'd eventually... Another stop. He couldn't finish the sentence cleanly, and they both knew why. The ending was choose me, and saying it out loud would require him to hear how it sounded. Dorian. Her voice was not cruel. It was what it had always been. Clear and final, and kind in the way that true things are kind even when they hurt. I was never going to choose anyone out of having nothing. That's not what people do. That's not what I do. He nodded once, slowly. He's going to hurt you, Dorian said. Not on purpose. Men like that, kings, they don't mean to, but you don't get to warn me about him. She said it gently. You lost that standing a long time ago. He left without another word, and she watched him go with the complicated, exhausted feeling of someone who had just closed a door that should have been closed years ago and felt neither victorious nor entirely at peace. Kaden appeared beside her, close enough that his arm was almost against hers. You okay? Ask me in 20 minutes. He nodded, accepting this, and they stood there a moment in the afternoon light, shoulder to almost shoulder, while Pip descended from a nearby roof beam and landed on her head with the subtlety of a bird who had decided subtlety was overrated. For the record, Pip said, I called it. I said bad idea from the beginning and I want that acknowledged. You said the tower was a bad idea. I said lots of things were bad ideas. Statistically, one of them applies here. Kaden looked up at the sparrow on her head. This time he didn't try to stop the smile. It rained that evening. Not dramatically. No thunder, no lightning. None of the theatrical weather that seemed to show up in stories at convenient emotional moments. Just a steady, quiet rain that turned the castle courtyard dark and sent everyone inside and made the corridors smell like wet stone and wood smoke. The kind of rain that had no agenda except to fall. Lara found Kaden in the East Tower. He had lit the fireplace. Just a small fire. Cautious, almost tentative, like a question rather than a statement. He was sitting on the floor in front of it, back against the old leather chair, with his father's drawing in his hands and the expression of a man who had finally walked into a room he had been standing outside of for 3 years. She stopped in the doorway. Do you want company, or do you want me to pretend I wasn't here? He looked up. The firelight caught the angles of his face and softened them in a way that daylight didn't. Company, he said. If it's you. She sat beside him on the floor, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and said nothing for a while. The fire did the talking, crackling softly, settling into itself, filling the cold room with something it had been missing for a long time. He used to bring me up here on Sundays, Kaden said eventually. We'd read, he'd draw. I'd argue with Rook about whether wolves could learn chess. A pause. Rook can't learn chess. He cheats and then denies cheating and then questions the validity of chess as a concept. Chess is arbitrary. Rook's voice drifted up from somewhere below. I stand by this. Lara smiled. What was he like? Your father? Tired, mostly. But the good kind of tired. The kind that comes from doing something real. Kaden set the drawing down on the floor between them, facing up. He told me once that the hardest part of being king wasn't the decisions. It was learning to still be a person while you were making them. His voice was quiet, without performance. I haven't been very good at that second part. You've been practicing, she said. He turned his head and looked at her, and she was close enough now that she could see the exact moment the careful composure he wore like a second skin simply stopped. Not dramatically. Just quietly, the way armor comes off when you're finally somewhere safe. Lara. Her name in his mouth sounded different than when anyone else said it, like it meant something specific rather than just being a label. What do you want? Not from me? Not from the castle. Just in general. What do you actually want? Nobody had ever asked her that. She understood, in the silence that followed, that this was not a casual question. It was the kind of question a man asks when he is trying to understand whether what he's beginning to feel makes any sense, whether the person in front of him is real in the way he's starting to believe they are. I want to wake up somewhere and not immediately calculate whether I'm allowed to be there, she said. It came out quieter than she intended, and more honest than she'd planned, and she felt the familiar instinct to walk it back with a joke. She didn't. He held her gaze. You're allowed to be here. You might want to consult Duchess about that. She has opinions about territorial rights. I do, Duchess confirmed from the doorway, where she had appeared silently, as cats do, carrying the general energy of someone who had come to supervise. She looked at both of them, looked at the fire, looked back. This is acceptable. Then she walked to the warmest spot in the room, turned 3 times, and settled. High praise, Pip said from the window ledge, rain damp and entirely unbothered about it. Pip, you're wet, Lara said. I'm choosing to experience this as atmospheric. The letter from Dorian arrived the next morning, and it was not what anyone expected. Nessa brought it to Kaden with the careful expression of someone who had read it accidentally on purpose and was processing the contents. It was short. A single page, no legal language, no council letterhead. Just handwriting, slightly uneven, the kind that happens when someone writes without drafting first. I am leaving the territory. I am not filing further grievances. I want it noted, not for legal record just because I need to say it somewhere, that I know what I did was wrong. I told myself a story about it for years, and I believed the story. I'm not sure I believe it anymore. Tell her, if she'll hear it, that I'm sorry. Not sorry the way people say it when they mean, sorry it didn't work. Sorry the way you mean it when you were the one holding the match. D. Hale Kaden read it twice, then set it on the table. Will you tell her? Nessa asked. Yes. No hesitation. She deserves to know. He found Lara in the stables where Ajax was delivering what appeared to be an extremely detailed personal opinion about the quality of his morning feed. I'm not saying it's inadequate, Ajax was saying. I'm saying it lacks ambition. It's oats, Ajax. Oats can be presented with intention. This was poured. There's a difference. Kaden stopped in the stable doorway, taking in the scene. Lara standing with her arms crossed, genuinely engaged in a feed-quality debate with a 17-hand horse, who was making his case with the gravity of someone presenting to a board. Something in his chest did the thing it had been doing more and more frequently since she arrived. That unhurried, undeniable shift, like tectonic plates moving in slow, inevitable agreement. Dorian is leaving, he said. She turned. He handed her the letter. She read it once, standing in the amber light of the stable, rain still running off the eaves outside. When she looked up, her expression was complicated in the way real emotions are complicated. Not simple relief, not forgiveness exactly, just the careful, honest response of someone who had been hurt by a person and could hold both truths at once. He meant it, she said. The apology. I think so too. She folded the letter once. I'm not ready to forgive him, but I'm also not going to carry it anymore. She handed it back. That's the best I can do right now. That's more than enough. Ajax, who had been listening with his large ears in full rotation, decided this was an appropriate moment to insert himself. He extended his nose and pushed it firmly against Kaden's shoulder, nearly knocking him sideways. Emotionally resolved, Ajax announced, "Now, about the oats." "We're not doing this right now," Kaden said. "I have prepared remarks." Ajax. "They're very short remarks." Lara was already laughing, that real laugh, the one that filled rooms. And Kaden turned to look at her, and the look on his face was so unguarded and so entirely undefended that Nessa, passing the stable door on her way to the kitchen garden, saw it, stopped, pressed her clipboard to her chest, and walked away quickly before anyone noticed she'd been tearing up. She reported the development to Duchess at lunch. Duchess, eating, did not look up. "Obviously," she said. "You keep saying that. Because it keeps being true." She licked her paw with great dignity. "I knew the first night." The dining room laughed. "That room hasn't laughed in years. When a room laughs again, you pay attention." Nessa set down her tea. "And you think it's real?" Duchess looked up then, with the ancient, unhurried certainty of a creature who had been watching humans make things complicated since long before any of them had learned to read. "The wolf brought her here," she said. "The king followed without thinking. She fixed a dying animal with bare hands and almost burned for it and still doesn't regret it. Does that sound like something that isn't real?" Nessa didn't answer. Outside, in the stable, Ajax was still making his case about the oats, and Lara was still laughing, and Kaden was letting her, and the rain had finally stopped, and somewhere above it all Pip had found a dry beam and was surveying his expanding territory with the quiet satisfaction of a sparrow who had, against considerable odds, ended up exactly where he needed to be. 3 weeks had passed since the hearing. 3 weeks in which the castle had quietly, incrementally changed. Not in any way you could point to on a floor plan, but in the way places change when the people inside them start to breathe differently. Fires lit earlier. Meals stretching longer. Corridors that had been purely functional, becoming places where conversations happened, and then continued, and then resumed the next morning, as if they had never really stopped. Nessa had stopped recording it in her mental log because the entries had become redundant. Day 15, they talked in the library until the candles ran out. Day 17, he asked her opinion on the Eastern Territory water dispute. She had one. He used it. Day 20, he laughed at breakfast. Actual breakfast, not dinner. Progress. The animals had their own system of documentation. 7 times this week, Rook said from his flat stone in the courtyard to Duchess, who had relocated there for the afternoon sun. 7 times what? He's found a reason to be wherever she is, without making it obvious, or attempting not to make it obvious. A pause. He's not very good at it. Nobody is, Duchess said. That's rather the point. Lara was in the castle library when it happened, not the dramatic it. That would come later. This was a smaller it, the kind that matters more in the long run, the moment she stopped pretending, entirely to herself, that she was not falling. She was sitting cross-legged on the wide window seat, with a book about medicinal plants she had found on the 3rd shelf, annotating the margins in the small, precise handwriting she had developed from years of writing on whatever scraps of paper she could find. Outside, the late afternoon light was doing something unreasonably beautiful to the ridgeline. Inside, the library smelled like old paper and cedar, and the faint wood smoke that had become, in 3 weeks, simply the smell of being somewhere she was supposed to be. Kaden walked in with 2 cups of tea, set one beside her without asking if she wanted it, and sat in the chair across from her with his own book, and said absolutely nothing. That was it. That was the moment. Not a grand gesture. Not a declaration. Just a man who had learned in 3 weeks that she took her tea without honey, that she needed quiet while she read, and that being near her was something he had stopped justifying to himself and started simply doing. She looked at the tea, then at him. He was already reading, or performing reading, and she could see the exact effort it cost him not to look up. "He practiced that entrance," Pip said from behind her book. Pip. 3 times in the hallway. I watched. She closed her book, keeping her finger on the page. Kaden. He looked up with the careful neutrality of a man who had been waiting for his name. "Thank you for the tea." "It was on my way." "The kitchen is on the opposite side of the castle." A pause. "I took the scenic route." She looked at him for a long moment, and he looked back, and the space between them was full of everything that had been building for 3 weeks. Every conversation that had ended 1 sentence too early. Every moment in the East Tower. Every almost in the stable yard. Every time one of them had stepped back from something that neither of them had yet said out loud. "We're being very careful," she said. "Yes." "Is that working for you?" Another pause, longer. Less and less. He kissed her in the library doorway an hour later. Not impulsively. Kaden Blackthornne did nothing impulsively, which was both his greatest professional asset and, historically, his greatest personal obstacle. He had thought about it precisely long enough to understand that thinking about it further was not going to produce new information, and then he had closed the distance between them with the quiet, deliberate certainty of a man who had finally made a decision and was entirely at peace with it. It was brief. It was warm. It was the kind of kiss that asks a question rather than making a statement. And when he pulled back just enough, her eyes were still closed for 1 extra second before she opened them. "That took you a while," she said. "I was being careful." "I noticed." She looked at him with that direct, undeflected gaze that had been undoing him since the square. "You can stop!" From behind them, from the corridor, came the sound of Nessa walking past at a brisk and entirely unconvincing pace, and then, several seconds later, the distant but unmistakable sound of someone telling Duchess the news, and Duchess responding with a single word that carried across the courtyard and up through the library window, with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had been right for 3 weeks and intended to accept this moment fully. Obviously, what nobody had anticipated was Croft. He appeared at the eastern gate 2 days later, not with a message from Dorian, who had been true to his word and crossed the territory line without looking back. Croft had come on his own, with the slightly queasy expression of a man whose conscience had been arguing with his survival instincts, and the conscience had recently gained the upper hand. He asked to speak to the king. He was shown to the main hall. He sat down across from Kaden with his forgettable face doing something unusually readable, which was the look of someone about to say a thing they could not unsay. "I was hired to find information about you," Croft said. "Weaknesses, old decisions, things that could be used." Kaden's expression did not change. "By hail." "Yes, but—" Croft reached into his coat and placed a folded document on the table. "What I found instead was this. I wasn't looking for it. It was in the regional archive, misfiled under land records." He pushed it forward. "I think it belongs to her." Kaden unfolded it slowly. It was a birth record. Formal, sealed with a territorial crest that had been partially obscured by a water stain and years of neglect. The names were clear enough. A woman called Marin, listed as mother, and beside the entry for the child, female, born winter, healthy, a father's name that Kaden read once, then again, with the particular stillness of someone recalibrating. The father's name was Edmund Ashvale, who had been a territorial lord of the Eastern Ridge, who had died without acknowledged heirs 14 years ago, whose lands had reverted to Crown administration and sat technically in legal limbo, awaiting a claimant who had never materialized, because nobody had known where to look. Kaden set the document down and looked at Croft. "Why are you bringing this to me instead of selling it?" Croft was quiet for a moment. "I've been doing this work for 12 years. finding things people want to use against other people. He looked at his hands. This one, I don't know. It felt like something different, like something that was supposed to be found. He stood. I don't want anything for it. He stopped, searched for the words, gave up on the elegant version. She nearly burned, and she had a name the whole time. That bothered me. After he left, Kaden sat alone in the hall for a long moment. Then he picked up the document and walked toward the library, where Lara was still annotating her plant book, and where Pip was conducting what appeared to be a territorial negotiation with the resident castle sparrows that had escalated significantly in ambition since his arrival. Rook was in the doorway before Kaden reached it. Is it good? Rook asked, reading his face. It changes things. For her? Kaden looked at the document in his hand, at the name on it, at the sealed crest of a man whose daughter had been sleeping under a stream overhang for 3 winters, while his lands sat unclaimed 40 miles east. It gives her everything she was always supposed to have, he said. Then it's good, Rook said, and stepped aside. The message arrived at breakfast, not with trumpets, not with a royal seal, not with any of the grand flourishes people in stories seemed to love when bad news was trying to be dramatic. It came with Nessa's face first, pale, tight around the mouth, and then with the parchment in her hand, and then with the sound of the entire room going quiet in the way rooms do when the air has changed. Kaden took the letter, read the first line, and set his jaw so hard Lara could see the muscle jump. It's from the East Ridge office, he said. Lara looked up from her tea. That sounds ominous. It is? Pip, already perched on the back of her chair, leaned forward with all the gravity of a bird who had decided this was now his business. If this is another hearing, I'm leaving the species. Rook's ears flattened. Read it. Kaden did. The birth record had been verified. Twice. The archive seal was authentic. The name on the document belonged to a woman named Marin Ashvale, and the father listed was Edmund Ashvale, deceased lord of the Eastern Ridge. The correspondence from the territorial office was brief and bureaucratic in the most infuriating way. Lara was, by blood, the legal heir to the Ashvale holding. No one spoke for a moment. Lara stared at the page in Kaden's hand as if looking at it long enough might make it become less real. Her own name sat there in black ink like it had always belonged there, like it had been waiting patiently through all the years she had spent sleeping under bridges and behind stalls and in any patch of sheltered dirt she could find. Say it again, she whispered. Kaden's eyes found hers. You're the heir. The words landed with such force that she had to grip the table edge to steady herself. Not because she wanted land, not because castles and titles had ever meant anything to her, but because of what it meant underneath the legal language and sealed paper and formal signatures. She had not been forgotten by the world. She had not been a stray, not a mistake, not a girl the village could rename into nothing. She was someone. Across the room, Duchess lifted her head from her dish and blinked once, slow and royal. Took you long enough, she said. Pip turned toward her. You knew? Obviously. Why is everyone always obvious except me? Because you are a sparrow. Cruel. Dorian found out before lunch, which, in fairness, was impressive. Terrible, but impressive. He arrived at the castle gates in a carriage he hadn't bothered to hide, stepped down looking like a man who had made one irreversible decision and now had to live through the consequences of it. There was no arrogance left in him, only purpose, rough-edged and exhausted. He asked to see Lara. Kaden said no. Dorian said he would wait. So Lara went anyway, because she had no interest in making anyone else's cowardice her problem, and because somewhere under the shock of the morning, there was a quiet, dangerous curiosity about what he could possibly want now. They met in the outer courtyard, away from the main hall, with the wind moving through the hedges and Ajax snorting judgment from the stable yard, like he had been appointed emotional backup by the gods. Dorian looked at her for one long second, and then at the space beside her, where Kaden stood. Something flickered across his face. Not jealousy, not exactly. Grief, maybe. Or the final acceptance of a man watching the shape of his life become something he would not be invited to inhabit. "I heard," he said. Lara folded her arms. "That's usually how words work." A faint, almost reluctant huff moved through Dorian's nose. Not a laugh, but close enough that it startled him. "I didn't come to ask for forgiveness," he said. "I know better than that." "Good. I came because I need you to hear this from me before you hear it from everyone else." He looked down at his hands, then back up. "My father found out who you were before I did." The air changed. Lara went still. Dorian's expression tightened. "Years ago, he intercepted a filing from the East Ridge. Your mother had petitioned for recognition after your father died. The claim was buried. My father saw a girl with land attached to her name and decided it was easier if the world never knew." Kaden's voice came out like ice. "You're telling me Hale suppressed a legal heirship?" "I'm telling you my father did," Dorian said, and for the first time there was something ugly and unpolished in him. Shame, finally. Naked enough to hurt. "And I helped keep it quiet because I was young and angry, and I thought if I made your life smaller, maybe you'd have no choice but to look at me." Lara stared at him, not because she was surprised by the cruelty. That part she knew, but because he had finally said the quiet thing out loud. The thing that had sat under every unwanted gift, and every too-close conversation, and every time he had insisted on helping her with a face that always seemed to be asking for something in return. "You knew," she said. He nodded once. "And I told myself it was only paperwork, only one more obstacle, only enough delay to make your mother's petition meaningless." He swallowed. "I was wrong." For a moment, nobody moved. Then Lara did something neither man expected. She stepped forward, took the folded grievance letter from her pocket, the one he had written weeks ago, and held it out to him. "You don't get to use truth like a rescue rope," she said. Her voice was steady, but not soft. "Not after all that. If you're sorry, be sorry. If you're leaving, leave. But don't come here pretending this fixes you." Dorian looked at the letter in her hand, then at her, and something in him finally, visibly broke from the strain of pretending it hadn't mattered what he had done. "I know," he said, and this time there was no strategy in it at all. "I know." He took the letter, folded it carefully, put it in his coat. Then he stepped back and looked at Kaden, and that look held every version of himself he had ever been. The boy who had wanted, the man who had ruined, the person who had been too weak to stop the damage once it started. "I'm leaving for the coast tomorrow," he said. "I wanted to say it to her before I went." "Then say it," Kaden replied. Dorian's eyes returned to Lara. "I'm sorry," he said. "Not because I lost. Because I did this to you." Lara held his gaze a long moment. Then she nodded once, not forgiving, not accepting, but recognizing the shape of the truth for what it was. "That," she said, "is the first honest thing you've said to me." Dorian closed his eyes briefly, like a man taking in a blow he had earned. And then, he was gone. The castle was quiet after that in the way it gets before a storm breaks, except the storm was not weather, it was change. Kaden found Lara later in the library, standing by the window with the land deed in her hands, looking out toward the East Ridge as if she could already see the shape of a life she had never been allowed to imagine. "You don't have to decide anything today," he said. She gave a breath that might have been a laugh on a better day. "That's good, because today I am not capable of deciding which part of me is most likely to burst into tears." He came to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him through the air between them. You could go there and rebuild it, he said. Or you could let the crown administer it until you're ready. Or you could sell it and never think about it again. And what would you do? He looked at her, very evenly. I would go wherever you chose to be. Something in her expression softened so suddenly it almost hurt to see. You really mean that? Yes. She turned then, facing him fully. You know this is unfair, right? What is? You. Saying things like that and sounding like you've spent your whole life being trained to ruin women's ability to think clearly. A full smile finally arrived on his face, slow and helpless. That may be the kindest accusation anyone has ever made against me. She laughed then, and he did too, and the sound of it filled the library with a warmth that made the dust in the sunlight seem less like dust and more like gold. Outside, rain began to tap softly against the windows. Pip, from somewhere near the rafters, muttered, "This is deeply inconvenient for my emotional stability." Duchess answered from the shelf above them, "No one asked your stability for permission." Rook, from the doorway, gave the small sound wolves make when they are amused against their will. And Lara, still holding the deed, looked at Kaden as the rain thickened and the room around them seemed to settle into place like it had always been waiting for this exact version of them. Not healed, not finished, but home in the making. 3 years later, the first thing Lara heard each morning was not the ache of memory, not the scrape of old fear, and not the sound of the village waking up around her with its usual suspicion. It was laughter. Soft at first, then louder, then impossible to ignore. A small boy with dark curls and a very serious expression stood in the sunlit courtyard of the Ashvale estate, arguing with Pip over whether he had, in fact, been attacked by the sparrow or merely emotionally challenged by him. Pip, now fat with castle privileges and absolutely unbearable with pride, insisted the child had started it by stealing a raspberry tart from the kitchen windowsill. I did not steal it, the boy said, chin up. You absolutely committed tart theft, Pip replied. There were witnesses. Name one. Duchess. From the top step of the terrace, Duchess opened one golden eye and said with complete dignity, I refuse to be subpoenaed. Lara laughed into the mug in her hands. The sound still surprised her sometimes, even after all this time. Not because it was rare now. It wasn't. But because for so long, laughter had been something that happened around her, to other people, in rooms she wasn't allowed to belong to. Now it lived here, in the bright stone courtyard of a home that had once belonged to her father and had been reclaimed, repaired, and filled with life. The Eastern Ridge was no longer a legal limbo. Kaden had seen to that, though he had insisted on making the transfer with as little ceremony as possible and as much paperwork as necessary. Lara had chosen, after many sleepless nights and a surprising number of arguments with Nessa, to restore the estate rather than sell it. Not because she needed grandeur, because she wanted the place to breathe again. So it had. The old manor had become a refuge for women cast out by their families, for children with no useful last names, for travelers, healers, and a few elderly men who were mostly there because they had arrived, immediately fallen in love with the food, and never left. The garden had expanded. The stable had been repaired. The East Tower study, once locked and haunted by absence, now served as a library for anyone who wanted to learn to read. And the woman who had once slept in alleys now had a room with windows facing the sunrise. She still preferred the window seat. Some habits, after all, were sacred. Kaden came through the courtyard just after sunrise, carrying their daughter on one hip and a stack of papers in the other hand. He looked very much like a king who had learned, at long last, how to be a man in public without disappearing behind the crown. The black and silver had not changed. The house colors remained. The realm still knew his name. But there was softness in him now that had not existed before Lara arrived in his life. Not weakness. Ease. The little girl in his arms reached for Lara before he had even crossed the last few steps. Mama. That single word still hit Lara in a place so deep it almost hurt. She set down the mug, crossed the courtyard, and took her daughter from him with a smile she did not have to force, not even a little. The child smelled like sun and milk, and the rose water Nessa insisted was necessary after bath time. Her dark hair was a mess. Her cheeks were round and warm. And her eyes, bright amber, unmistakable, were watching Lara with the solemn attention of someone who had already decided her mother was the center of the universe. Lara pressed a kiss to the girl's forehead. Did your father try to finish a stack of documents before breakfast again? Kaden made a sound of mock offense. I'll have you know I finished most of them. Pip, perched on the railing, gave a dry chirp. He means he moved them from one side of the desk to the other. Rook, lying in the grass nearby, lifted his head. He does that a lot. Kaden glanced at both of them. Traitors. Duchess stretched lazily on the sun-warmed step. We are historians. The little girl leaned over Lara's shoulder and pointed at the papers. What's that? More land matters, Kaden said. Boring. Lara grinned. She gets that from me. No, Kaden said, looking at their daughter with great seriousness. She gets it from me. I'm extremely exciting in private. Lara turned toward him with lifted brows. Exciting in private? His expression did not change, which meant it was already too late. That came out wrong. Pip nearly fell off the railing. Duchess gave the most feline sound possible for as expected. The child, who did not understand the scandal she had just witnessed, clapped her hands and demanded to know if breakfast meant jam or honey. It meant both. Because in this house now, breakfast meant both. By mid-morning, the courtyard had filled with voices. Nessa had arrived from the kitchen with a basket of warm bread and a look that still carried the authority of someone who had once run a castle staff and now ran half a household, 2 gardens, and at least 1 emotional crisis per day. Ajax stood in the stable yard, pretending not to watch the bread with interest. The older children from the refuge were helping water the herb beds. A young woman Lara had once found sleeping under a bridge in the city now read aloud from a book to a circle of little ones on the terrace. The place had become what Lara had always wanted without knowing she was allowed to want it. Home, not as a building. Home, as a living thing. Kaden joined her beside the rosemary bed, where she was pinching back the new growth with careful fingers. You look tired, he said. I am tired. You slept. Barely. He smiled a little. The child had nightmares? Your daughter had opinions about moonlight and refused to accept them quietly. She's very talented. She also kicked me in the ribs and then apologized to the blanket. Kaden lowered his voice. Need me to take her tomorrow night? Lara glanced at him. Are you offering because you want to help, or because you have a meeting in the morning and are trying to negotiate your own sleep? He looked insulted. Both. She laughed, and he watched her the way he still watched her sometimes. Like a man who could not quite believe the life he'd been handed and had no intention of ever taking it for granted. Rook, passing behind them, muttered to Pip. He still looks at her like that. Like what? Pip asked. Like she is the only warm thing in the world. Pip was quiet for a moment, which for Pip was rare enough to count as weather. Reasonable, he said at last. Later, after the children had gone indoors for lessons and the sun had climbed high enough to warm the stone all the way through, Lara went alone to the East Tower. The study was different now, not because the furniture had changed much, not because the walls had been painted, but because the room no longer belonged to silence. Books lined the shelves. A map of the East Ridge hung beside the fireplace. A small vase of fresh flowers sat on the desk, placed there each week by whichever child had drawn the short straw, and then usually forgotten they were supposed to remove them. The old charcoal sketch of young Kaden and Rook still rested in its frame, but now there were new drawings beside it. Crayon suns, crooked castles, wolves with absurdly large smiles. and in the center of the desk sat a sealed packet. Lara frowned, crossed the room, and recognized the handwriting immediately. Dorian Hale. She opened it carefully. The letter inside was short. I am on the coast. I teach now, mostly boys who are too arrogant for their own good and too hungry to learn anything useful. The sea air is doing me some favors. I have finally learned that being useful is not the same as being wanted, which I suppose is the lesson I should have learned years ago. I hope she is happy. I hope you are too. I know that words are poor compensation for damage, but I am trying to become someone whose words no longer arrive too late. There was no request in it, no demand, no plea for absolution. Only the shape of a man trying, very late, to become better than the damage he had made. Lara folded the letter once and slid it into the drawer. She did not forgive him, not in the clean storybook way, not because forgiveness was impossible, but because some wounds did not need to be named as healed in order to stop bleeding. That was enough. That was honest. And honesty, she had learned, was kinder than performance. She stood in the tower room a while longer, looking out over the ridge. The old ache she had carried for so long no longer ruled her. It still existed, somewhere. History never vanished. But it had become smaller, less central, more like a scar you could press without pain. Behind her, footsteps on the stairs. Kaden entered quietly, stopped when he saw her at the window, and leaned against the frame with that easy familiarity that had once felt impossible and now felt like the most natural thing in the world. "You disappeared," he said. "I came to check on the past." "And?" "It's behaving itself." He smiled. "That's good." Lara looked at him for a long moment, taking in the man he had become, the one who had once ridden into a square to save a woman he did not know, and then stayed long enough to become her husband, her partner, the father of her child, the person who still made her heart stutter with a simple look across a room. "You know," she said, "I used to think love would feel like being claimed." Kaden's expression changed, just slightly. "It feels more like being found," she continued. "Again and again, even when I wander off." He crossed the room, stopped in front of her, and touched the back of his fingers to her cheek. "Then I'll keep finding you." And because some promises deserved to be answered with more than silence, Lara pulled him in by the front of his shirt and kissed him. It was not hurried. It was not desperate. It was warm and certain and filled with all the quiet, ordinary miracles they had built out of the wreckage of everything that came before. When they parted, his forehead rested briefly against hers. Outside, a child was laughing. Somewhere below, Rook barked at Ajax for stepping on the herb border. Pip was loudly explaining to the younger sparrows that he had, in fact, risen to become a key domestic advisor in a royal household. Duchess, likely from the sunny stare, was pretending to ignore all of them while still monitoring every sound. Lara closed her eyes for one breath, then another, and understood, with a calm that would have once felt impossible, that this was the ending she had been moving toward all along, not perfect, not polished, but full. Epilogue. Years later, when people asked Lara how she survived the village, the humiliation, the fire that never touched her, and the life that followed, she always gave the same answer. "I didn't survive alone." And that was true. She had been saved by a wolf with an injured paw, a king who forgot how to smile, a castle full of opinionated animals, a stubborn housekeeper, a bird with no sense of boundaries, and a love that did not ask her to be smaller than she was. Most of all, she had been saved by the moment the world finally called her by her real name. At dusk, she still walked the courtyard with her daughter on her hip. Sometimes Kaden followed, sometimes Rook. Sometimes all the children in the house came with them. The east tower glowed with lamplight. The rosemary grew wild. The old refuge had become a true home. And every once in a while, Lara would stop at the edge of the garden, look at the life she had built, and smile like a woman who had once been rejected by the world and had somehow, gloriously, been answered by it.